Before I share this haunting tale from the Kentucky frontier, I want to thank everyone who continues to watch and support these videos. To those who have subscribed and especially to our channel members whose names are now appearing on screen, your support makes all the difference in keeping this community thriving. If you're interested in becoming a channel member, you'll find the link below. Tonight, we travel to a place where hospitality was sacred, where sharing a meal was the highest honor a family could bestow upon a guest. But in the hills of eastern Kentucky in 1836, one iron cooking pot became an instrument of death, serving 3 separate feasts that would claim the lives of 16 people and expose one of the most calculated murder sprees in American frontier history. The year 1836 found Kentucky still very much a frontier state. Despite having achieved statehood nearly half a century earlier, the eastern regions, where our story unfolds, remained largely wilderness, carved into small settlements connected by treacherous mountain paths and the occasional river route. The population was sparse, consisting mainly of families who had ventured west from Virginia and the Carolinas in search of cheap land and new opportunities. Floyd County, established just 14 years earlier in 1822, epitomized this rugged frontier existence. Named after John Floyd, a Virginia surveyor who had been killed by Native Americans while exploring Kentucky, the county stretched across some of the most challenging terrain in the state. Dense forests of oak, hickory, and chestnut covered rolling hills that gave way to steep mountain ridges. Rivers like the Big Sandy and its tributaries provided the primary means of transportation and communication with the outside world. The county seat of Prestonsburg was little more than a cluster of wooden buildings around a courthouse square, with fewer than 200 permanent residents. Most of the county's population lived on isolated farms scattered throughout the hollows and valleys, sometimes miles from their nearest neighbors. This isolation bred a culture of fierce independence and mutual reliance. When help was needed, neighbors came without question, and when hospitality was offered, it was considered both sacred duty and genuine pleasure. It was into this world that Jeremiah Nathaniel Holbrook had arrived in 1829, claiming to be a widower from Tennessee, seeking a fresh start after losing his wife and children to cholera. Jeremiah was a man of medium height but powerful build, with dark hair that was already showing gray at the temples despite his apparent age of 35. His hands were calloused from hard work, and he spoke with the measured cadence of someone accustomed to making every word count. What set Jeremiah apart from other settlers was his remarkable skill in the kitchen. He claimed to have learned cooking from his late wife, who he said had been raised in New Orleans, and had taught him the secrets of Creole cuisine. This was exotic knowledge in the Kentucky mountains, where most cooking consisted of simple preparations of corn, pork, and whatever game could be hunted or trapped. Jeremiah settled on a 40-acre plot along Beaver Creek, about 8 miles northeast of Prestonsburg. The land had been abandoned by a previous settler who had given up after 2 failed harvests, and Jeremiah was able to purchase it for a fraction of its assessed value. He built a small but sturdy cabin and began clearing additional land for farming, but it quickly became apparent that his true passion lay in cooking rather than agriculture. Word of Jeremiah's culinary abilities spread throughout the scattered community with remarkable speed. In a region where entertainment was scarce and social gatherings were treasured, the prospect of a meal prepared by someone with actual training in the cooking arts was irresistible. Jeremiah seemed to understand this perfectly, and he began inviting neighbors to elaborate dinners that became legendary throughout Floyd County. These dinners were served from a massive iron pot that Jeremiah claimed had belonged to his grandmother. The pot was enormous, capable of holding enough stew or soup to feed 20 people, and it was beautifully crafted with intricate designs molded into the iron. Jeremiah treated this pot with reverence, claiming it was the source of his cooking magic and never allowing anyone else to touch it or help with the cleaning. The meals Jeremiah prepared were unlike anything the mountain folk had ever tasted. He somehow obtained spices and ingredients that were unavailable to other settlers, creating complex flavors that lingered in memory long after the meal was finished. He would spend days preparing for these dinners, hunting specific game, gathering wild herbs and mushrooms, and combining ingredients in ways that seemed almost mystical to his guests. By 1834, Jeremiah Holbrook had become something of a celebrity in Floyd County. His dinner invitations were coveted, and families would travel for hours through difficult terrain for the opportunity to taste his legendary cooking. He seemed to enjoy this attention immensely, often entertaining his guests with stories of his travels and his late wife's family recipes while they ate. However, there were aspects of Jeremiah's behavior that struck some observers as peculiar. He never accepted invitations to dine at other people's homes, claiming that his delicate stomach could only tolerate food prepared in his special pot. He was also extremely secretive about his ingredients and methods, never allowing anyone to observe his cooking process and becoming agitated if anyone ventured too close to his kitchen while he was working. More troubling were the questions that began to arise about Jeremiah's past. Despite his claims of being from Tennessee, his accent seemed to shift depending on his audience, sometimes sounding more like Virginia, other times carrying traces of what sounded like Georgia, or even further south. When pressed for specific details about his previous life, he would become evasive, changing the subject or launching into elaborate stories that were difficult to verify. There were also concerns about Jeremiah's financial situation. Despite claiming to support himself through farming, his crops were notoriously poor, and he seemed to have no other visible source of income. Yet he somehow managed to afford exotic ingredients and maintained a lifestyle that suggested resources beyond what his circumstances should have provided. When neighbors offered to help with his farming or suggested he might benefit from taking on additional work, he politely but firmly declined all assistance. The first feast that would earn its place in Kentucky's criminal history was held on September 15, 1836. The occasion was ostensibly a celebration of the harvest season, though Jeremiah's own harvest had been typically meager. He had invited 12 families from throughout the surrounding area, including some who would need to travel most of a day to reach his cabin. Among the invited guests were the Wendell family, Robert and Martha Wendell with their 3 children, ages 6, 9, and 12. Robert was a respected farmer who had helped Jeremiah when he first arrived in the county, offering advice on crops and lending tools. The Wendells were known for their generosity and their strong Methodist faith, and Martha was particularly admired for her skill with herbal remedies. Also invited were the Morrison clan, old Samuel Morrison, patriarch of one of the county's founding families, along with his son Thomas, daughter-in-law Ellen, and their 2 young sons. Samuel had served as a militia captain during the War of 1812 and was considered one of the most influential men in Floyd County. His presence at any gathering lent it an air of importance and respectability. The third family group consisted of the Blackwood relatives, brothers Jesse and Caleb Blackwood, both bachelors in their 20s, along with their widowed sister Mary Catherine Blackwood and her 7-year-old daughter. The Blackwood family had been among the earliest settlers in the region, and their combined land holdings made them quite prosperous by local standards. Finally, there was the Turner family, Ezekiel and Hannah Turner, with their teenage daughter Rebecca. Ezekiel served as a lay preacher for the local Baptist congregation and was known throughout the county for his powerful sermons and his dedication to helping struggling families. Hannah was skilled in weaving and often traded her cloth for goods the family needed. The feast began in the late afternoon, as was customary for such gatherings. Jeremiah had spent 3 days preparing, and the aromas emanating from his cabin had been tantalizing the entire neighborhood. The centerpiece of the meal was a massive venison stew, prepared in his famous iron pot and seasoned with herbs and spices that created an intoxicating fragrance unlike anything the guests had ever encountered. Jeremiah served the stew with cornbread, wild greens that he had gathered himself, and a selection of preserved fruits that he claimed to have brought from his previous home in Tennessee. The meal was accompanied by corn whiskey that Jeremiah had somehow obtained, though distilling was illegal in the county, and most families made do with weaker beverages. The dinner conversation was lively and warm, as was typical for such gatherings. The men discussed farming techniques and local politics, while the women shared news about their families and communities. The children played together in the cabin's main room, their laughter adding to the festive atmosphere. Jeremiah was the perfect host, ensuring that everyone had plenty to eat and keeping the conversation flowing with stories and jokes. As the evening progressed, several guests began to compliment Jeremiah on the exceptional quality of the stew. The meat was incredibly tender, and the combination of flavors was unlike anything they had ever tasted. Jeremiah beamed with pride, explaining that the secret was in the slow cooking process and the special blend of seasonings that had been passed down through his wife's family. It was near sunset when the first guest began to feel unwell. Young Rebecca Turner complained of stomach pain and nausea, symptoms that were initially attributed to having eaten too much of the rich food. However, within minutes, several other guests began experiencing similar symptoms. The stomach pains quickly intensified, accompanied by severe cramping, vomiting, and difficulty breathing. Martha Wendell, who had experience with herbal medicine, immediately recognized that the symptoms were consistent with poisoning rather than simple indigestion. She began trying to help the afflicted guests, but the progression of their illness was rapid and severe. Within an hour of the first complaint, several guests were convulsing, and it became clear that something was terribly wrong. Jeremiah appeared genuinely shocked and distressed by the turn of events. He claimed to feel perfectly fine himself, explaining that he had eaten very little because he had been too busy serving his guests to properly enjoy the meal. He ran to fetch water and tried to help Martha Wendell in her efforts to provide relief to the suffering guests. As the night wore on, the situation became increasingly desperate. Old Samuel Morrison was the first to die, succumbing around midnight despite the best efforts of those trying to help him. His son Thomas followed within the hour, leaving Ellen Morrison widowed with 2 young children who were themselves severely ill. By dawn on September 16th, the cabin that had been filled with laughter and fellowship just hours earlier had become a scene of unimaginable tragedy. 6 people had died during the night: Samuel and Thomas Morrison, both of the Morrison boys, Rebecca Turner, and little Mary Catherine Blackwood's daughter. 6 others remained critically ill, including Martha Wendell and Ellen Morrison. Word of the disaster spread quickly throughout Floyd County. Neighbors arrived to help tend to the survivors and to remove the bodies for burial. The local doctor, a man named Silas Crawford who served several counties and was rarely available, was summoned but would not arrive for 2 days due to his location when the message reached him. Jeremiah's behavior during this crisis struck many observers as odd. While he appeared appropriately distressed and helpful, he also seemed surprisingly composed for someone whose dinner party had resulted in multiple deaths. He readily agreed to have the remaining stew examined, and claimed to be as baffled as everyone else about what could have caused such a catastrophe. The survivors were taken to various neighboring homes to recover, while the dead were prepared for burial. The funerals, held over the next several days, were among the largest gatherings in Floyd County's short history. The entire community was in shock, struggling to understand how such a joyous occasion had turned into such a tragedy. When Dr. Crawford finally arrived, he examined both the survivors and samples of the remaining food. His conclusion was that the victims had been poisoned by some substance mixed into the stew, though he was unable to determine the exact nature of the poison with the limited resources available to him. He noted that the symptoms were consistent with several different toxic plants or minerals that could be found in the Kentucky wilderness. Suspicion naturally fell upon the possibility of accidental poisoning. Perhaps Jeremiah had unknowingly gathered toxic mushrooms or other harmful plants while preparing the ingredients. This theory seemed plausible given his admitted practice of foraging for wild ingredients, and most of the community was inclined to view the tragedy as a terrible accident rather than a deliberate act. Jeremiah himself seemed to accept this explanation, expressing deep remorse for having served food that had caused such suffering. He vowed never to cook for others again, and asked the community's forgiveness for his role in the tragedy, however unintentional it might have been. However, not everyone was satisfied with the accidental poisoning theory. Martha Wendell, who had survived but remained weak from her ordeal, pointed out that the progression and severity of the symptoms seemed more consistent with deliberate poisoning than with accidental ingestion of toxic plants. She also noted that Jeremiah had been unusually insistent that everyone try the stew and had seemed to pay close attention to how much each guest consumed. Her concerns were shared by Jesse Blackwood, who had lost his niece in the tragedy. Jesse was known for his sharp mind and suspicious nature, and he began quietly investigating Jeremiah's background and behavior. What he discovered would eventually lead to the uncovering of one of Kentucky's most shocking criminal cases. Jesse's first discovery was that Jeremiah's story about his origins in Tennessee could not be verified. A trip to Nashville and inquiries with various county clerks revealed no record of a Jeremiah Nathaniel Holbrook matching his description. More disturbing was the discovery that there had been no major cholera outbreak in the regions Jeremiah claimed to have lived in during the time he said his family had died. Further investigation revealed that Jeremiah had been asking subtle but persistent questions about the finances and property holdings of many of his dinner guests in the weeks leading up to the feast. He had also been observed making trips to Prestonsburg and other towns, supposedly to purchase supplies, but often returning with no visible purchases and offering vague explanations about his activities. Jesse shared his concerns with Dr. Crawford, who agreed to conduct a more thorough examination of the remains of the stew and other food served at the dinner. Using more sophisticated techniques than had been available during his initial examination, Dr. Crawford was able to determine that the stew had been contaminated with a substantial quantity of white arsenic, a poison that was readily available in the region as rat killer and mining chemical. The discovery of deliberate arsenic poisoning transformed the investigation from an inquiry into a tragic accident into a murder case. Sheriff William Henry Clay, a nephew of the famous Kentucky statesman, took personal charge of the investigation and ordered Jeremiah's arrest on suspicion of murder. When confronted with the evidence of arsenic poisoning, Jeremiah initially maintained his innocence, suggesting that someone else must have tampered with his food. However, a search of his cabin revealed several containers of white arsenic hidden in various locations, far more than any reasonable explanation could account for. More damning was the discovery of a detailed journal hidden beneath the floorboards of Jeremiah's cabin. The journal contained meticulous records of his guests' eating habits, their family situations, and most shockingly, his assessments of their wealth and property holdings. The journal revealed that the September 15th dinner had been planned as the first of several such gatherings designed to eliminate specific families and individuals. The journal entries painted a picture of a calculating predator who had been carefully studying the Floyd County community for years, identifying targets based on their wealth, their isolation, and their likelihood to accept invitations to his famous dinners. The September 15th guests had been selected because they represented some of the most prosperous families in the region, and their deaths would have created opportunities for property acquisition and inheritance manipulation. Under intense questioning, Jeremiah eventually confessed to the murders, though he claimed they had been motivated by financial desperation rather than mere greed. He revealed that his real name was Jeremiah Nathan Holcomb, and he was wanted for similar crimes in Georgia and South Carolina. He had been moving from state to state, establishing himself in communities, gaining trust through his cooking abilities, and then eliminating selected victims through poisoned meals. The most chilling revelation was that Jeremiah had been planning 2 additional feasts, scheduled for October and November, that would have targeted different groups within the Floyd County community. His journal contained detailed plans for these future murders, including lists of intended victims and notes about the most effective methods for administering poison to different age groups. The second feast had been planned for October 20th and was to have been presented as a celebration of Jeremiah's gratitude to the community for their support during his time of grief following the September tragedy. The intended victims included several of the most prominent remaining families in Floyd County, including the families of Sheriff Clay and Dr. Crawford, the very men who would eventually uncover his crimes. The third and final feast was to have been held in November, supposedly as a Thanksgiving celebration. This feast would have targeted the remaining wealthy families in the region, effectively eliminating most of the county's established leadership and creating chaos that Jeremiah apparently believed he could exploit for his own benefit. The trial of Jeremiah Nathan Holcomb began on November 15, 1836, exactly 2 months after the poisoned feast. The courthouse in Prestonsburg was packed beyond capacity, with people traveling from throughout eastern Kentucky to witness the proceedings. The case had attracted attention from newspapers as far away as Louisville and Lexington, making it one of the most widely reported criminal trials in Kentucky's history to that point. The prosecution was led by Commonwealth Attorney James Mitchell Brown, a rising political figure who would later serve in the Kentucky legislature. Brown presented a methodical case that included testimony from the survivors, evidence of the arsenic poisoning, and extensive readings from Jeremiah's journal. The journal entries were particularly damaging, as they revealed not only premeditation, but also a complete lack of remorse for the victims. The defense was handled by Colonel Marcus Talbot, one of the most respected attorneys in eastern Kentucky. Talbot faced an almost impossible task, as the evidence against his client was overwhelming. He attempted to argue that Jeremiah had been driven to madness by the loss of his family, and that his actions, while inexcusable, were the result of mental illness rather than criminal intent. However, Talbot's strategy was undermined by the revelation of Jeremiah's true identity and his history of similar crimes in other states. Testimony from law enforcement officials in Georgia revealed that Jeremiah had been suspected in at least 3 other cases of mass poisoning, though he had always managed to escape before being arrested. The most compelling testimony came from Martha Wendell, who had survived the poisoning and had maintained her suspicions about Jeremiah's role in the tragedy. Her account of the evening, delivered in a strong voice despite her continuing health problems, painted a picture of a man who had been carefully monitoring his guests' consumption of the poisoned stew and who had shown no signs of illness himself. Dr. Crawford's testimony regarding the arsenic poisoning was thorough and convincing. He explained to the jury how the poison would have been administered, how it would have affected the victims, and why Jeremiah's explanation of accidental contamination was impossible, given the quantity and distribution of arsenic found in the food. Perhaps most devastating was the testimony regarding Jeremiah's journal and his plans for future murders. The reading of specific passages from the journal, in which Jeremiah had calculated the value of his victims' property and discussed the most efficient methods for eliminating entire families, left the courtroom in stunned silence. The trial lasted 5 days, during which the courtroom remained packed with spectators. The jury, composed of 12 local farmers and tradesmen, deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning a verdict of guilty on 6 counts of first-degree murder. Under Kentucky law, the penalty was death by hanging. Judge Abraham Lincoln Shelby, who presided over the trial, sentenced Jeremiah to death and set the execution date for December 15, 1836. In pronouncing sentence, Judge Shelby noted that he had never encountered a case involving such calculated evil and such callous disregard for human life. He expressed his belief that Jeremiah's crimes represented a betrayal of the most sacred traditions of frontier hospitality and community trust. The execution of Jeremiah Nathan Holcomb took place as scheduled on December 15, 1836, in the courthouse square of Prestonsburg. An estimated 2,000 people gathered to witness the hanging, making it the largest public gathering in Floyd County's history. Jeremiah maintained his composure until the end, offering a brief statement in which he claimed to have found religion during his imprisonment and asked forgiveness from the families of his victims. The iron pot that had been used to serve the poisoned feast was destroyed immediately after the trial, burned in a large fire that also consumed all of Jeremiah's cooking implements and personal belongings. The community felt that these items were too tainted by their association with the murders to be allowed to continue existing. The property where Jeremiah had lived was abandoned and eventually reclaimed by the wilderness. Local legend maintains that nothing would grow on the site where his cabin had stood, and the area came to be known as Poison Hollow, a name it retains to this day. The impact of the Holcomb murders extended far beyond Floyd County. The case was widely reported throughout Kentucky and the surrounding states, and it contributed to growing awareness of the vulnerability of frontier communities to predators who exploited traditions of hospitality and neighborly trust. In the immediate aftermath of the murders, many communities throughout eastern Kentucky became much more cautious about accepting invitations from newcomers or strangers. The tradition of elaborate community dinners, which had been a cornerstone of frontier social life, was permanently altered by the fear that such gatherings could be used as opportunities for mass murder. The case also led to changes in law enforcement practices throughout Kentucky. Sheriff Clay's investigation had revealed significant gaps in communication between counties and states, allowing criminals like Jeremiah to move freely from place to place while avoiding detection. New procedures were established for sharing information about suspected criminals, and efforts were made to improve coordination between law enforcement agencies. The surviving victims of the September 15th feast faced long and difficult recoveries. Martha Wendell never fully regained her health and died in 1839, her death widely attributed to the lasting effects of arsenic poisoning. Ellen Morrison, left widowed with no children after losing both her husband and sons, eventually remarried and moved to Ohio, where she lived until her death in 1863. Jesse and Caleb Blackwood, who had lost their niece in the murders, became prominent advocates for improved law enforcement and criminal justice reform throughout Kentucky. Jesse served 2 terms in the state legislature, where he sponsored legislation requiring better record-keeping and communication between county sheriffs. The families of the victims established a memorial fund that provided assistance to other families affected by violent crime throughout eastern Kentucky. The fund, administered by local churches, continued to operate until the Civil War disrupted life throughout the region. The Holcomb case also had lasting effects on the broader Kentucky legal system. The use of detailed journal evidence in the prosecution set important precedents for future criminal cases, and the thoroughness of Dr. Crawford's forensic examination became a model for other physicians dealing with suspected poisoning cases. The story of the 3 poisoned feasts served from the same iron pot became embedded in Kentucky folklore, passed down through generations as a cautionary tale about the dangers of trusting strangers and the importance of community vigilance. The case inspired several ballads and folk tales that were still being sung in eastern Kentucky well into the 20th century. Modern forensic analysis of the surviving evidence, conducted by researchers at the University of Kentucky in the 1960s, confirmed that the victims had indeed been killed by massive doses of arsenic administered in their food. The researchers noted that Jeremiah's method of poison administration was sophisticated for its time, suggesting that he had considerable experience with such crimes. The case remains one of Kentucky's most notorious mass murders and is studied by criminologists as an early example of a serial killer who used social situations to access multiple victims simultaneously. Jeremiah's careful planning, his use of his cooking reputation to gain trust, and his methodical selection of victims based on their wealth all demonstrate characteristics that would later be recognized as typical of organized serial killers. The iron pot itself, despite being reportedly destroyed, became the subject of numerous legends throughout eastern Kentucky. Some claimed that fragments of the pot had been secretly preserved, and that these fragments brought bad luck to anyone who possessed them. Others maintained that the pot had not actually been destroyed, but had been hidden away, waiting to be rediscovered by some future evil individual. The site of Jeremiah's cabin, now deep within the Daniel Boone National Forest, is occasionally visited by historians and curiosity seekers, though little evidence of the original settlement remains. The area is still known locally as Poison Hollow, and some residents claim that the water in nearby streams has an unusual taste that they attribute to contamination from Jeremiah's crimes. The broader community of Floyd County eventually recovered from the trauma of the Holcomb murders, but the case left lasting changes in the social fabric of the region. The easy trust and openness that had characterized frontier hospitality was permanently altered, replaced by a more cautious approach to welcoming strangers and accepting invitations from people whose backgrounds could not be verified. The case of Jeremiah Nathan Holcomb and his 3 planned poisoned feasts remains a stark reminder of how individuals with evil intent can exploit the best impulses of human nature, the desire to welcome strangers, to share what we have with others, and to build communities based on trust and mutual support. In the Kentucky mountains of 1836, these noble impulses nearly fell victim to one man's calculated greed and callous disregard for human life. Thank you for joining me as we explored this dark chapter from Kentucky's frontier history. The story of Jeremiah Holcomb and his iron pot of death serves as a sobering reminder that evil can hide behind the most innocent facades, and that vigilance is the price of community safety. Please share your thoughts about this case in the comments below, and I'll see you next week as we delve into another fascinating and disturbing tale from history's shadows.